Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest CYCJ webinar. I'm Charlotte Morris, and I'm delighted to introduce Jan Green and Maxine Jolly, who will today present on how we can uphold children's rights in the context of communication needs in the justice system. As we know, over half of children and young people in the justice system present with speech, language, communication difficulties, which means that they may struggle to understand the system, which lead in turn to longer sentences and more unfair outcomes. And as Scotland proceeds towards incorporating the UNCRC into domestic law and ensuring the rights of these young people are met and upheld is even never before. With extensive experience across justice and education sectors, Jan and Maxine are well placed to provide practical information around what communication needs like, what we need to be aware of, and also how to uphold the rights of children and young people. Jan and Maxine are going to talk for about 45 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity for questions, and my colleague Maureen will address these to Jan and Maxine if you just put them into the comment box. And just to flag up as well, you may be interested in our 2-day training course of practitioners on speech, language and communication needs of children, and that's taking place this December, and it's an excellent opportunity to develop your understanding in this area, and you can find out more details. And before we start, if you're tweeting on social media, please use the hashtag CYCJwebinar. Thank you. I'll now hand you over to Maureen Roberts, who's our Practice Development Advisor, leads in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. I'm just going to take 1 wee minute just to give you a bit of information as to why we're here today and a bit of the background. The Children's Rights Implementation Group was set up under the Youth Justice Improvement Board to take forward the priorities and actions related to children's rights and participation under the new Youth Justice Vision published by the Scottish Government last year. So the Speech, Language, Communication Needs subgroup was set up, and we feed into the Children's Rights Implementation Group. So I chair the Speech, Language, Communication Needs subgroup, and Maxine and Jan are both members of that group. One of our priorities is to raise awareness of speech, language, communication needs for our children and young people in conflict with the law. And as Charlotte mentioned, there is a high prevalence in that population. So Collective as a group, we thought producing a webinar would be an ideal way to get the message out there and raise awareness. As Charlotte said, we've got a 2-day training programme in December that I'll put in the chat for people to have a look at, and click on that if you're interested. And hopefully January, February, we're going to produce a podcast as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over now to Jan Green.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint up here and then we'll get started. Okay, here we go. Now I can't see anybody's faces, so I'm broadcasting into a black hole, but hopefully you'll all be able to hear me and see me okay, and we'll get going. Okay. So I'm a speech and language therapist working with children and young people and adults in the justice system. And you know, we know that speech language difficulties are common in this population, and that speech and language therapists have a particular interest in developing understanding across different sectors of the sort of communication needs that present and how we can work with them. But I thought it'd be useful to take a few moments to think about what we're meaning when we talk about speech, language and communication needs, and also what sort of prevalence there is and why these difficulties occur. So sometimes when I go into certain settings, people will be surprised to see a speech therapist, and they'll say, oh, their communication's all right, they can speak okay. And that's probably partly a fault of speech and language therapists, that we often refer to ourselves as speech therapists. So quite often people think of what we're doing as being helping people with just speech difficulties. This diagram here shows the kind of layers of communication that we work with. So your red layer on the outside is the kind of most immediately obvious type of communication difficulties people might have, which would be your speech difficulties, what people might refer to as speech impediments, or differences in how people produce speech sounds, stammering, lisps, that type of thing, fluency of speech more generally. And these are things that speech therapists do work with, but they're probably the thing that we work least often with when we're working with children and young people in conflict with the law. That's probably the smallest area of difficulty we encounter, but it's probably the thing that's most readily apparent when you're dealing with someone. What we do is we focus in more on these two inner layers, which are content and use. Sorry. So content, we're talking about things like words, grammar, vocabulary, word selection. And use, we're talking about how people put all their communication skills together in the context that they're interacting with all their non-verbal skills as well as their language skills, to be able to create communication that's meaningful and relevant to the context. So although difficulties with content and use aren't as obvious as difficulties with form when you first speak to a young person, they're probably areas of difficulty that have more of a serious impact on people's ability to engage, to form relationships and so on. So we know that there's common difficulties. Charlotte mentioned a 50% figure. I'm probably going to argue it's a bit higher, probably about 80% would still be quite conservative as an estimate for how common these difficulties are in terms of working with children and young people who are in conflict with the law. What I would say is when you're working with this population, assume that the young person has communication difficulties, unless you've got a reason to think that they don't. And let's go on to thinking about why that is. The why is a big part of this, because in our general population, about 5% of children and young people at any one time have a speech and language difficulty, and I've just spoken a moment ago about almost all young people who are in conflict with the law having difficulties. Not absolutely all, but very, very many. So why is that? Let's look at that in a wee bit more detail. We're going to think about the brains of the young people that we work with. How do their brains develop? Why are their brains in some way different to those of people who don't have communication difficulties? And we know that there's certain life experiences and certain environmental influences which are particularly common amongst children and young people that we work with. Some of the key moments that we want to think about are the genetic and in utero influences. So here we're thinking about whether somebody might have a genetic predisposition to differences in how they communicate, and also whether there are any kind of in utero influences such as extremely high level sustained maternal stress, not normal stress, but very high conflict sustained stress on the mother can have some effects on neurological development. And also going back to that sort of genetic influences, we might be thinking about neurodevelopmental conditions, autism, ADHD, learning disability, and so on, that will have an effect on how somebody communicates. Then we want to think about the early relationships that people have and the early environment that they're brought up in. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail for the next couple of slides. I want to think about the fact that in terms of communication development and relational skills, there are critical periods where your brain is very much focused, especially at a very early age, on developing in certain ways. And there's also sensitive periods which are perhaps less fixed than critical periods, but we do know that there are certain skills and abilities that you need to acquire by certain stages, otherwise it's going to be very difficult for you to acquire those later on. And also later on today, we're going to talk about neural pruning, which is the process of specialisation of the brain, which is so important for brain development and function as we get older and move towards later childhood and adulthood. So let's think about early relationships and the early relationships that might be experienced by the children and young people that we support. Now, people of any background or any situation may experience suboptimal, we might call it parenting, or problematic early relationships. So in order for a child to develop adequate communication skills, they need to have a reciprocal communication relationship with a small number, usually one or two main caregivers from a very early age that's consistent, that's reliable. And the reason for this is that at this stage, when communication is developing so quickly in the early months of life, the messages that the child's brain gets from usually the parent interacting with them really help to shape how they develop their communication skills. So when we pick up a baby and talk to it and say, oh, you tell me a story when they make a noise, or they stick out their tongue, so you stick out your tongue, and vice versa, and so on. What we're doing there isn't just something that's cute and fun. What we're also doing there is laying the absolutely key fundamental foundation stones of communication skills. And without consistency at this early stage, it's very difficult to then build language and communication skills of more complexity, because the foundations that help us understand how communication works and helps our brain to understand the reciprocal nature of communication is disrupted. So we can see this in children who are deprived of consistent early relationships, either through things like neglect, through abuse, or through external disruption, for example, parental illness or death, that type of thing. So there's a variety of reasons why children might not have access to consistent high quality early relationships, but we do know that children and young people who are in conflict with the law are much more likely to have had inconsistent early relationships than your average child. So that's already placing them at a significant disadvantage to how they develop their communication skills, how they develop understanding how language functions and how interactions function. We also want to think about the early environment, which is wider than just the sort of caregiver roles, but it's also about the sort of wider advantages and disadvantages that might be afforded to children in different situations. There was a study done in the 1970s, which has many faults in it, so I'm not going to say it was the perfect study, but in the study we did find some really interesting information as well, where researchers looked at in-home interactions of children of different socio-economic groups. They did this in the States, and what they would call the sort of least advantaged group, they called the welfare families. So I think we can understand what they mean by that when they're talking about that. And then the most advantaged group in their study were families who were very affluent and very comfortable socially and didn't have any kind of like financial or social challenges. And what they found was there was a huge difference between the amount of words that were used in different home environments. And they found that in the welfare families, as they called them, there's probably 30 million less words used towards an individual child by the age of 5. So what we're finding there is that children in this study, which has now been replicated across a number of studies, children in the most deprived households are exposed to a lot less language in their early years. And the quality of language that they're exposed to was also found to be quite different, more directive, less descriptive, less reciprocal interactions. Now, these aren't absolutes. Of course, there's families who are very poor and very deprived who have excellent high quality communication with their kids and who are very engaged with them and who are very linguistically able. And there's also really affluent families who are highly disengaged from their children and don't have these quality of interactions. I mean, I have to say the study surprised me. I assumed the most affluent families might have less time to interact with their children and pay less attention to them. But what is found to kind of compensate for that is what we might call meta-parenting, where adults maybe do research about parenting, read web articles about parenting, and feel that, you know, they're kind of more actively aware of what needs to be done to help their child develop, so they may compensate for lack of time to be more focused when they are present. So we do know that as a trend, although there's obviously going to be individual exceptions, children in the most deprived households, economically deprived, are also somewhat linguistically impoverished in many cases. And we see this reflected in like nursery admissions in different parts of the country. So in the parts of the country where there's the greatest amount of socioeconomic deprivation, often more than half of all children starting nursery there will have speech language communication needs, whereas we're looking more at 5% or slightly less in the most affluent areas. So that's quite a big difference. And, you know, you really need to think about, you know, children in their first 5 years of life having 30 million less opportunities to learn how language works, 30 million less opportunities to develop their own communication skills. It is a huge disadvantage, and that's why early intervention and support for families is so important. Why we see things like funded nursery placements. They aren't there to like give parents a break, although that's also a helpful function. They're there to help expose children to a more equitable environment, a more language and socially rich environment that helps them develop their language and communication skills and put them on a more equal footing to their peers who may be more advantaged even at this kind of early age. So early environment, exposure to communication, to literacy, different types of interaction is really key, again, in developing early communication skills. And we know that many of the children and young people we work with are disadvantaged in that area. So what's happening in a child's brain when they're having these early relationships and these early environmental situations? Some of you have seen this slide before, showing neurons, a sort of illustration of neurons in the brain, and neurons being our nerve cells, which we have billions of, and which allow all of our cognitive functions and other brain functions to take place. You see in the first slide here, which shows an example of what neuron organisation might look like at birth. So quite sparse. I mean, there's still billions of neurons there, but relatively sparse compared to other pictures. Not very clear pathways or joined up areas. So, you know, when you pick up a baby and go, oh, I wonder what she's thinking, the answer is probably not very much in the early months of life, because they just don't have the neuronal connections to have loads of active thinking going on. But what we do know is that through time, neurons proliferate, they grow, they join together. And here we see a child in kind of primary school age, a very densely packed set of neurons there. But what we also know about that is that there's a reason why 7-year-olds aren't the most intelligent and able members of society, because they haven't had a chance much to specialise their brain function yet, to develop their knowledge and their skills. So even though there's loads of neurons there, they're not necessarily working in the most organised way. They may be understimulated at times, that kind of thing. So there's those kind of issues. We also know that as time goes by, that as children get older, they have more kind of specialisation. So when we look at the 15-year-old, the teenager here, what we're seeing is that they actually have less densely packed neurons. They've actually got brain cells dying off already. A bit of a depressing thought to think that by the age of 15, our brain cells are already dying off, and it sounds a bit like a downward trajectory for all of us who are over 15 to know that our brain cells are dying off all the time. But actually this process of brain cells dying off is really important, because it allows our brains to specialise and strengthen pathways. It's a kind of use it or lose it hypothesis, that the more we use certain skills, the more our neural pathways will strengthen and specialise to them. So what I would argue is that many of the children and young people we work with who haven't been in consistent communication-rich environments when they're young, there's not actually anything wrong with how they've developed. The problem is that their brain is specialised to maybe an unpredictable, stressful environment where there's not much interpersonal communication and not much communication about thoughts and emotions. And then we expect them to function in a society that's all about empathy and taking turns and sharing other people's point of view and expressing yourself politely but freely and this kind of thing. So their brains have specialised to maybe an abusive environment or a neglected environment, and now we want them to function in a different environment, but they haven't had the opportunity to develop and strengthen those neural pathways. The good news is that this process that we're talking about goes on up until the mid-20s at least. So the children and young people we're working with aren't the finished article. They can develop their communication skills, they can develop their interpersonal skills, and with that get all the advantages that having adequate communication skills brings. And one of the most important things about developing communication skills through any part of childhood is the interpersonal relationships they have. So if you can be predictable, if you can be regulated, and you can be clear in your communication, that's incredibly supportive of the development of the children and young people that you're working with. What I want to think about a little bit more is that process of brain development in the early years, and for children who are particularly stressed in that time, what the further implications for brain development might be. Now, we all develop stress, and experience stress every day. I mean, I was stressed earlier when I was having some computer setup issues for this, but it was just a little blip. So on this picture here, I would say I was in the yellow zone, you know, definitely stressed, maybe heart rate up a bit. Are we going to get this already 1 o'clock? But, you know, speaking to colleagues on it, we're going to sort it out, have a backup plan, and then go back down to the kind of green zone. And right now I'm probably in the green zone. I'm definitely more stressed than I would be if I was sitting at home having a cup of tea. But, you know, I'm not stressed or de-stressed or anything like that. So we all experience different levels of stress and go up and down throughout the day with that. And even children who are in a good supportive environment experience stress and experience tolerable stress, easy for me to say. And when we're thinking about tolerable stress, we might think about things like my 6-year-old wanting to play Roblox at 6:30 this morning, which wasn't going to happen. But she was pretty upset about it because it was a game she really wanted to play. So she was definitely huffing about and throwing herself around a little bit. But, you know, was she out of control? Was she at the point of a sustained amount of distress? No, she was just upset, and she got some comfort and basically told that this isn't happening, and gradually in time she had a pancake and came back down to the positive level of stress of looking forward to school and talking about Halloween and so on. So those kind of ups and downs are normal, but what we might call toxic stress would be the red zone stuff here, which is where children are highly stressed for extended periods and they don't have protective relationships to help regulate them and help to regulate their responses to that. So an example of this I would give you would be of a young person I worked with once who was in an extremely abusive household, and in order to protect him and his sister from that, his mum kept them in their hall cupboard and would go in. This is when he was kind of like toddler age, and would go in at times when the abusive parent wasn't around and speak to them briefly and bring them food and so on. But most of the time they were on edge waiting for some kind of explosion from the adults to happen. They weren't sure when food was coming, and they didn't have an adult sitting, putting them on their knee and saying, "Are you okay? Would you like a cuddle?" or anything like that. So their brains are going to be bathed in increased levels of stress hormones, neurotransmitters, activating to help them respond to this stressful environment. But the kind of downside of that is that not only does it specialise their brain to that kind of environment instead of the kind of environment they might be expected to function in, but also it affects how neurons develop. So here we have a look at a typical neuron, which looks a bit like a bushy tree, doesn't it, with lots of parts feeding off to join into the other neurons and form pathways. What we know is where children's brains are bathed in stress for extended periods at a very high level with little regulation or sort of down times from that they have fewer connections on their neurons, so it really actually affects how their brains develop and greatly disadvantages them. So the big takeaway from all this for me is that a lot of time when we're working with children and young people, their brains are great. Their brains have specialised to the situation that they've grown up in, and now we're asking them to function in a completely different environment. So maybe the environment has to do some of the work to accommodate them rather than expecting them to accommodate this different environment. What we will often see when we're working with children and young people who have experienced high levels of childhood stress is that their arousal levels can be detrimental to them at times. So if we see this when we're talking about stress levels going up and down, we all have a kind of window of function in the middle here, what is sometimes known as the window of tolerance, which is an optimal arousal zone. So, you know, you can't be totally relaxed all the time. If I was completely relaxed right now, I'd probably stop speaking and just lie back and go to sleep, which probably wouldn't be a great idea when I'm in the middle of doing a webinar. But what we also know is that the young people that we work with quite often are around the level of becoming hyper-aroused, of becoming over-animated, over-aroused, perhaps angry or aggressive, or overexcited, or they may be quite flat and prone to dropping down and becoming under-aroused, passive, and so on. And that will have a big effect on both how they communicate with people, how well they're able to process communication, because it's very hard to process other people's communication when you're not in your optimal arousal zone, and also how their communication continues to develop. So we know that a lot of the young people we work with have speech language communication needs. Let's just take 1 or 2 more minutes before we finish up to think about the implications for practice. So we know that often these difficulties aren't recognised. They may be overshadowed by behavioural issues. People may just assume that someone is disengaged or aggressive, for example, that it's a purely behavioural issue, but it may also be that they're not understanding what you're expecting of them, for example, or they're not able to express what they're thinking very easily. We have norm shifting. There's a kind of idea that there's a typical young offender or typical young person that we deal with, how they communicate. We kind of forget, well, is this actually normal for somebody of their age or not? There's also some certain expectations about what somebody with speech language communication needs acts like or looks like. And particularly when we have young people who are maybe quite streetwise or in some ways quite kind of socially sophisticated, or they're not very geeky or anything like that, or they're not very naive seeming on the surface. That might be regarded as not having speech language communication needs, but of course there can be a wide range of presentations. The children and young people we work with often miss early opportunities for engagement. I very often see people who've been offered speech therapy in school, but they've never had the opportunity because of like house moves, parental withdrawal, not getting taken to appointments, parents not filling in consent forms, that kind of stuff. Sometimes these difficulties are subtle, they're not always really, really obvious, so it's easy for people to overlook them. We know that many of the young people we work with have psychosocial disadvantage, less access to good quality relationships, and therefore less opportunity for people to help and support them. And also just professional prejudice, conscious or unconscious, against young people, maybe either from certain backgrounds or have certain ways of communicating, especially if their ways of communicating aren't necessarily particularly appealing to other people. So there's a lot of barriers to recognising the needs of the young people we work with. But there are some things we can do to break that wall. When you're working in an environment which has a lot of young people who are in conflict with the law, we should really be trying to actively identify those who have communication difficulties, maybe having speech therapy support for screening or recording things, making sure that any existing reports are checked and information shared with relevant staff. We also want to make the system work for people with communication difficulties more generally, because we have to assume that they're so common. We don't have to wait to identify each individual. So we want communication to be clear, information to be accessible. Very often interventions are verbally mediated. Are there other ways to do that? Can you get some help from speech and language therapy to do that? The behavioural support approaches are positive rather than punitive, especially as a lot of young people we're talking about have executive function difficulties, so they might not be able to regulate their behaviour very well in advance. And the stuff that we said before about therapy, about relational development, you know, the absolute number one most important thing that I'm quite often asked this question, what can you do for children and young people in conflict with the law who may have communication difficulties? And there's a number of things. Build a relationship with them, that reciprocal relationship that's calm, that's warm, that's boundaried, but supportive, will help their communication development, will help you to recognise the times that they're finding communication difficult as well. So that's absolutely the number one thing I would recommend. The other thing I would recommend is to access training, to access support, and increase awareness in your team. We've already referenced the training that's coming up in December, so if you can get some of your team members or yourself on that to look at these issues in a lot more detail, look at some practical strategies, that would be great. And there'll also be some resources and information getting shared with you after the webinar. So thank you everybody who is out there. I'm now going to hand over to Maxine, who has her own presentation to look at aspects of today's subject in a little bit more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan, and some great points there that I'll certainly also be picking up on. I'm just wanting to check that everybody can see my presentation.
Yeah, that looks
yes.
Good.
That's great, thanks. Okay, I want to start with this point about listening must start with the assumption that it will lead to change. That is absolutely crucial. There's no point in us listening to children and young people and taking on board what their views are if we don't do anything about it. So we need to have that in the back of our minds all the time. And what I want to do here is almost rewind a bit. How do we stop our children and young people getting into the criminal justice system in the first place? How do we provide that right support within the education system and develop those relationships that Jan was referring to make sure that they have the right level of support moving forward? So I'll not dwell on this. You would know what the aims of the session are. I've seen it already. But I'm wanting to, on the next two slides, to give you a couple of quotes from the preamble of the UNCRC. The UNCRC is an international treaty, and it's there to make sure that children have all of the things they need to develop and be safe and healthy and protected. And this is such a nice quote because it emphasises that atmosphere of happiness, love and understanding. And again, that links into some of the points Jan was making around early childhood In a family environment doesn't necessarily mean it's their own family. We know that for all sorts of reasons, children sometimes have to be looked after, but they still should have that opportunity to experience happiness, love and understanding. And then another quote from the preamble is talking here about dignity, inalienable rights, peace, justice, freedom. These are things that are so crucial, particularly when we're looking at children who end up in the criminal justice system. But I really want to focus on dignity as well, because how often are children and young people denied their dignity through the processes that are just institutionalized throughout their educational experiences and then beyond. So what is it? I'm often asked, what is a rights-based approach? Now, this is my favourite quote of to explain what a rights-based approach is. This comes from Together Scotland, who are an alliance of children's charities that work to improve the awareness, understanding and implementation of the UNCRC across Scotland. And they produce an annual report. Although this report is from 2017, it's still a very, very relevant definition of what a rights-based approach is. And when you're looking at across services, this is not education specific, it's not social work specific, it's not a speech and language therapist or a health professional specific. It cuts across everything. So I think it can be a really useful lens for looking at when you're trying to meet the needs of all learners and thinking about how do we embed a rights-based approach in our practice and across all of the organisations that we work with. Some of you will be aware that over the past few years we've had both the Additional Support for Learning Review, which is often called the Morgan Review, and the Independent Care Review, which is usually referred to as the Promise. The purpose of this slide here is to help everybody to see that these things are all very much connected. They're not independent, they're not in silos. You can see at the top there, you've got your articles from the UNCRC, and then how they link to the themes from Additional Support for Learning Review, and then how that also connects to the foundations of the Promise. So they're very much joined together. But what we've picked out in Education Scotland is 4 common themes, and those are rights and participation, relationships, wellbeing and care, and inclusion and universal support. And if in education we can make sure that those things are embedded in all settings, then we're going to make sure that our children and young people are much less likely to end up in the criminal justice system. So a little bit more about the UNCRC here, just some basic background facts, and apologies if you already know this. But on the left-hand side there, we have to be very clear that rights are universal. They apply to all children, regardless of race, religion, abilities, family circumstances. And in Scotland, that is from birth up to age 18. They are unconditional. All children everywhere in the world are entitled to rights. They do not have to be earned, and they are absolutely not dependent on responsibilities. And that's something that I have to challenge all the time. They are inalienable. They cannot be given or taken away. They are inherent in that they're permanent and cannot be separated from the individual. And human rights and children's rights are indivisible. They are independent and depend on each other for their effectiveness. So, for example, children have the right to relax and play, and they also have the right to free assembly. And ideally, both of those need to articulate for them to work properly. Then we've got our general underpinning principles. So Article 2, without discrimination, that goes back to that principle of universality. Article 3, the best interests of the child. You could have a whole discussion about who decides what's in the best interests of the child, but it is also a useful article to refer back to when rights can appear to be in conflict, which they sometimes do. Survival and development, Article 6. I don't think anybody would argue about or be unaware of the fact that children have the right to survival, but that development aspect is where these other things that Jan was talking about come in, and about their ability to develop their communication needs, and education is key to that. And then the views of the child, Article 12 is absolutely crucial, and it's not just about giving them the opportunity to speak, it's about actually actively taking that forward. And then in education, we've got 3 specific articles that are really important. So that right to an education is that basic right. The second part of Article 28 talks about that dignity element, which I'll come back to in a minute. Article 29, developing every child's personalities and talents to the full. And that 31 around relax, play and take part in cultural and artistic activities. And I'm going to pick up on that in a little bit more in the next slide. But on the right hand side, we really need to think about inclusion and what does that mean? have you got a full curriculum, or is it being restricted? Have you got a curriculum that is interesting and relevant to your needs? Are you able to access school full time? I've come across many occasions when children and young people have been put, and I use the word put deliberately, onto a reduced timetable, and that sticks, and they're there for months, years sometimes, and nobody ever reviews it and thinks about why they're on that reduced timetable. Whole school experience, so it's about not just about being in class, it's about everything that happens within that school environment and how important that is for a child or young person to feel included. It absolutely needs to be suited to their needs, and there has to be that degree of flexibility and adaptability. We can't just say this is what we offer. And I've heard this a lot as well. I'm sure many of you have seen this. When we get to around about January, is your child ready for primary one? Not, is our school ready for your child? And that is the question that should be being asked. Okay, so a bit more about the education focused articles. As I said before, that emphasis on dignity. Discipline in schools has to uphold the dignity of the individual child or young person. So if you've got systems in a school or an education setting where children are sat on naughty chairs, they're standing out in the corridor, their names are written up on the wall, all of these sort of things undermine their dignity and are going to continue to add to feelings of humiliation and alienation, and that will feed into their disengagement from the system. Making sure that we develop every child's personality, talents and abilities to the full. What are these children interested in? What do they want to do? And let's not focus on exams, let's not focus on university, let's think about what would be genuinely interesting and stimulating for that child or young person and see how we can meet those needs. And then that wide range of cultural and artistic activities, making sure that we don't exclude children from school trips, for example, because they've got speech and communication language needs, they've got a physical disability, they are care experienced and they can't attend things after school because they're reliant on a taxi to take them back to their placement. All of these sort of things need to be thought about. And we need to make sure we don't exclude children who live in poverty because they can't afford things as well. But then broader than that, we need to think about these articles as well. So there is a right there around making sure that family help you to know about your rights. That, as I mentioned before, that right to meet with friends and to join groups. And how often do we see groups of young people being vilified and they're not doing anything, they're just meeting together. But it's people are scared because there's a group of young people together, and we need to start moving away from that demonising of young people. That right to privacy can be really important. Where are meetings held? How are they held? Who's present? Are we talking about children in front of them, especially if they've got communication needs and they are not able to particularly articulate what they're thinking, or are they just talked over? They should get information in lots of ways, as long as it's safe. So again, we need to make sure that they're not accessing inappropriate material that's not only inappropriate, but inaccurate and potentially dangerous on the internet. But then particularly when we're looking at the criminal justice system around Articles 39 and 40, you know, a lot of children who ended up in these situations may have been neglected, badly treated, ignored, attachment issues, and they absolutely need to have that right help if they have broken the law or been accused of breaking the law, and to be treated fairly. And the UNCRC should be taken into account with that, as should other human rights treaties as well. So just a little bit more about the additional support for learning review. When we're talking about children's rights, we have three themes, which are participation, provision and protection, which all of the articles sit within. And in terms of inclusive education, we talk about children being participating, present, achieving and supported. And by participating and present, we mean they're actively engaged. It doesn't mean you're just present in a classroom. It means that you are actually genuinely involved in what's happening and valued. All of the links that are on this slide here are within the Padlet that Holly I think is going to be sharing with you. But there's some really good points. You don't need to go and read the full document. If you can look at the executive summary, you'll get a feel of what it's about. But the main overarching recommendation was this: that children and young people must be listened to and involved in decision making relating to additional support for learning. Co-creation and collaboration with children, young people and their families will support more coherent, inclusive and all-encompassing policy making, which improves implementation, impact and experience. So we absolutely have to engage with learners and their families, carers, and so on, to make sure that their needs are being met. A little bit more about relating to Article 12. This is the Tresida model of participation and the different ways in which all settings can engage with children and young people. I'm not saying any of these are better than the others. It's not hierarchical, but I think if as an organisation you're only using one of these, you're perhaps missing an opportunity to look at the other ways in which you can engage. So I'll just give you a minute or two to read that, but while you're doing that, we have to remember that you can move across all of these. So you might start with something that's assigned but informed, but then it might end up at being young people initiated shared decisions with adults, because the young people have taken control of that and moved it forward into one of the other areas of participation. So it's a really useful model to audit what you are already doing to engage with the learners. So I assume everybody's getting the slides after this, so I'll just move on. These two slides have come from, again, a different publication from Together. This is their most recent State of Children's Rights report from 2022, and they have identified some key things that need to be in place if we're going to meaningfully engage with children and young people. So the things in bold there, they need to have accessible information. We can't start asking them about things if they don't know what it is they're being asked about. So they need to have that information in advance. So they need to be prepared for whether it's an individual conversation or whether you're talking to a group. We need to be sensitive to children's backgrounds and experience, and we need to make sure that children have the opportunities to initiate ideas and activities. So it's not just them endorsing what an adult says, it's them being able to come up with the ideas themselves as well. But to be able to do that, they also have to be supported and scaffolded in that process. We absolutely need to make sure that any situation where you're asking children and young people about their views is a child-friendly space that's right for them. We cannot just take a child or a young person into an adult environment and expect that they will be able to participate meaningfully, because it's not an environment that they feel comfortable in. And absolutely being inclusive. There should not be any kind of discrimination, even if it's unintentional. So we need to go back and think about, is the environment where we're asking for views the right one? And again, at the end, we need to follow up. So often children and young people tell us, well, yeah, I was asked about this, but then I don't know what happened, because we don't go back and close that loop and give them that feedback. So we need to make sure we do that too. Professor Laura Lundy from Queen's University in Belfast, a lot of great work that they've done there, and I think there was something in the Padlet too. It's not just about voice. Voice is can actually just imply that it's about speaking, but of course participation goes well beyond speaking. We have non-verbal learners, we've got people with communication needs that sometimes aren't comfortable in speaking, so we need to find other ways for them to be able to do that. So we need to give them the skills to be able to participate and share their views and support them to do that. Influence, you know, that this doesn't mean that we'll always follow through on what children and young people want. It might actually be in direct contradiction with Article 3 in terms of what's in their best interests and keeping them safe. But we need to make sure that wherever possible, they can influence actions. That audience aspect, we must listen respectfully, give due weight, and not done in a tokenistic way. And then space both in terms of an emotional space to give people time and place to think, but also a physical space so that children and people aren't being moved about because somebody else wants the room that they're in when they're wanting to have a conversation with whoever it might be, because somebody else says they've got priority to that room. So we need to make sure they've got physical space and emotional space. Can Scotland Be Brave is a recent publication, well, 2019, it's not that recent, I suppose now, from Scottish Government around putting Article 12 in practice, and there's a lot of really practical advice in there around engaging with children and young people who have speech and communication needs, and it's based on the use of talking mats. There was a lot of training happening in terms of using talking mats, and the feedback was very, very positive. And all the practitioners involved said that it improved relationships between themselves and the children, and reflecting back on what Jan said about the importance of relationships. So again, I think the link is in the Padlet. So if you have the opportunity to go and look at that, I would strongly recommend it. Now, on the next two Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear this?
As a parent, you learn lots of different strategies, and when I became the parent of a child with FASD, I had to change a lot of those strategies. They just no longer worked. FASD is a spectrum, and so it really does affect every single child differently. For my boy, his memory is affected, his executive functioning is affected. He doesn't understand consequences, so he will do the same thing again and again and again, even though it's not working for him. He can't find things. He is hyperactive in his ADHD. He struggles to not just remember things, but hold information or to access information. You could have told him something 100 times and he just can't remember it, or he can't access it. And yet yesterday he got it, he seemed to understand it, and today he doesn't. I understand for a teacher with a classroom of pupils, that's quite a challenge to learn how it individually affects each child. Unfortunately, when there is that lack of understanding or lack of knowledge, you can't then support the child in the way that they really need it. The worst cases that I've had or I've experienced, the impact on my boy has been that he's not wanted to go to sleep at night. He's had nightmares when he has gone to sleep, just really disturbed. He's got up in the morning, he's not wanted to eat anything. He's just literally felt so stressed at the idea of going to school. And he goes there and he feels that he's not seen, he's not heard, he's not understood. What's been asked of him, the expectations are way beyond his ability. He loses confidence in himself, but he might portray to the teachers that everything seems okay. Maybe he comes across as disruptive, maybe he comes across as, you know, hyperactive or just not focusing or withdrawing, but they're not seeing when he then comes home the meltdowns as a result of just not having the help and support that he needed that day.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next part of this video in a minute, but I just want you to hold that in your heads and think about, you know, that this is a young boy who obviously has communication needs, who's not understood, who's not listened to, or rather not heard.
There instantly comes to mind a teacher who got Jake. That's the easiest way of describing it, as she began to realise that he was incredibly talented, he was really creative. She began to think out the box. She began to use his favourite characters to engage him in her lessons. She made the lessons short and to the point, because she understood that his capacity was limited, and so therefore if she had him for 20 minutes, if he could last 20 minutes, she would make it fun and engaging. He was so interested in the human body topic and health topic that he came home and he built his own defibrillator, took it into school and showed the other pupils how to operate it. He was just actively participating in every class. He even shared his story about being adopted in front of the whole school. She could see when he would begin to get a bit antsy, more movement. And so she would give him movement breaks, and she would tell me that she would send him along to the office with a bit of paper that said, have a look at this, read this, and then send it back with Jake. And it was purely to give him a break to get out of the class. Sometimes she used jumping jacks in the class to use up some energy, because she understood that he was trying his best, but that his brain and his body weren't helping him. So she would accommodate for it. She understood that she needed to use short sentences, that she needed to give him time to process. She understood that he was always working hard and always wanted to please her, and so she would give him lots of praise. For me, the challenge is how to work with teachers to pass on what I've learned, what strategies I've learned, to help them, because even if they've had a child who's had FASD, they've experienced that before, it's a spectrum. So that child, boy or girl, will not be the same as my wee boy. So it really is about this partnership between home and school. And so I think that collaboration between home and school is really what I would love to see more of. I'm not there to tell the teacher what to do. I really am there to help. I don't want teachers to feel threatened that I might know more about it, because I've had to learn more about it as a parent, and I've had to learn specifically how it impacts my child. And so what I long for is to build that really positive relationship, because when I look at what happened when he wasn't supported, and I looked at the boy that he became when he was supported, it is so different. And that's why it's so important that home and school work together.
Okay, and for me, there's many messages that jump out, but the two big ones are about that partnership working, not just between home and school, but also with other partners as well. But also that teacher who got Jake didn't have any additional resource, she didn't have any additional training, she built those relationships and she took the time to get to know him, and that's what we all need to be doing. So just, be pleased to know I'm almost finished. Just some things for you to reflect on in terms of how can you help, in terms of championing people's voice, data collection. There's that old adage about, do we value what we measure or measure what we value? So we need to reflect on that. What matters to children and families rather than what just matters to us. Have that really much more effective and stronger multi-agency and disciplinary working. Early intervention, and Jan, I know you mentioned that as well. It is absolutely crucial if we're going to try and avoid children and young people ending up being disengaged in the criminal justice system, whatever it might be, and to be more creative, imaginative, prepared to take risks, and even. So in terms of your own roles, you might want to think about how does your setting embed rights-based approaches or support rights-based approaches. How can you work across a range of organisations? But then those last two questions, what do you need to do now? I think that's really crucial for you to go away after this and think about. But also, what further support do you need, whoever it may be from? So I've probably slightly run over time. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand back to Maureen.
Thanks very much, Maxine. We've just got a few minutes left for questions. We've had a couple of questions about the research that's been mentioned. I think your links are all on the slides, so you can go to the Padlet after the webinar and have a look. And Jan has given me the link for the research that she spoke about the welfare households. So that just leaves one question. I'm just going to read it out, and I'll probably just direct it to both. So if you suspect that a child or a young person's brain was affected by early experiences and now has less neural connections, what would be the intervention plan to address that and improve their communication ability? Jan, you're nodding. Do you want to go
sure,
first?
Yeah. I mean, it's going to depend obviously upon the individual child and the individual environment that they're in, but some of the principles that we would want to see are ensuring their access to consistent, stable relationships. We talked about that earlier. In the training that we're doing in December, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but one of the key aspects, as many of you will already be aware of communication development, is predictability, and that children understand that their even subconsciously, their communication has an effect. So we would want to see games and relationships that allow predictability, that allow children to see that their communication creates a response and so on. So that would be a big part of it. Again, it's going to depend on age and overall kind of needs. Again, we would want to try and do it as much as possible through play and linking kind of language development to play, whether that child is 5 or whether they're 15. I would still always favour using play. So for an example of some language enrichment stuff that I've done before with a group of young people in their teens who all have language difficulties and were in conflict with the law, would be we had a cooking group. But we used that cooking group to look at cause and effect, and we used it to look at adjectives and using words and things. Again, there was no time that I was going, by the way, we're working on communication here, we're going to practice words, we're going to practice vocabulary. It's just about creating those kind of natural opportunities. But the professionals involved should be doing it in a planned way and thinking about, well, how can we make this a language rich kind of activity. So it's that kind of thing. I would say play is going to be your kind of mainstay. But if a young person has significant difficulties in this area, I'd recommend you're trying to get advice from speech and language therapy for this, either some consultation or direct work. And speech and language therapy is an open referral service. So if you don't know how to access speech and language therapy in your area, just contact the local hospital speech and language therapy department and ask them to tell you how to find the right service, or contact the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists office in Edinburgh. I can get their link put onto the pad as well, and they'll advise you about how to access services.
Jan, thanks very much. A very comprehensive answer. I don't know, Maxine, if you would want to add anything from an education perspective. I know in your presentation you spoke about a flexible curriculum. I don't know if there's anything else you would want to add.
No, well, in theory, yes. I mean, if we're looking at the GTCS, the General Teaching Council standards, it's very clear that the curriculum should be inclusive, it should meet the needs of all learners and all teachers, you know, this is their responsibility. So that's very clear. And also, I would say almost all schools have a link to a speech and language therapist. I'd be very surprised if they didn't. So, you know, that's another route in. You can get that contact as well. So, you know, education is the inclusive service pretty much. So, well, education and health. So, you know, there would be routes that you could go through your local schools as well if you needed to find a contact.
Thanks very much. And we will put the links on the Padlet that you mentioned, Jan. I'd just like to say thanks very much to you both. And if you go away from today's webinar and you do have any questions for Maxine or Jan, you can just do that through the CYCJ mailbox, and we'll make sure that we get the questions to them. So the last couple of minutes.
So I was going to say very happy to have more questions from people. Thanks, Maureen.
Okay, that's brilliant. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to hand over now to Charlotte Morris just to finish up today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maureen, and thank you so much. Just to echo what Maureen said, that was a fantastic webinar, really interesting and lots to take away and think action. And as you say, you know, if you're interested in training, please check that out on our website. The link will be in the Padlet. We'll share that with all registered attendees. We'll send that around, and we'll also thank you very much for attending today, and look out for details of webinars 2020.